All right, let's jump right in. We're going to be looking at the book of Hebrews today. And let's be honest, it can feel a little dense, pretty complicated. But what if I told you there's a kind of hidden cultural code, a social operating system, if you will, that once you get it, the whole thing just clicks into place? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unlock.
So, let me start by asking you a question, and I want you to really think about it. What would it take for you to risk everything? I mean, public humiliation, suffering, and literally having all your stuff taken away. And not just putting up with it, but, and get this, accepting it with joy? Now, this wasn't some thought experiment for the people reading this letter. This was their actual life.
And that question gets right to the heart of the crisis here. The author is writing to a community that is getting squeezed from all sides. They're facing serious hostility from their neighbors just because of what they believe, and the cost of being part of this group is getting impossibly high. And we're not talking about just getting a few dirty looks. The pressure was intense and very specific. They were being publicly shamed, they were going through what the text calls a hard contest with suffering, and they were supporting their friends who'd been thrown in prison. You can see why. Because of all this, some people were starting to drift away. They were skipping the meetings. The whole commitment was starting to crack.
So how does the author handle this? He doesn't just give them a pep talk. No, he does something much smarter. He taps into the fundamental social code of their world, the unwritten rules everyone lived by. It was like their social operating system, and it was built on two huge ideas: patronage and reciprocity.
Okay, so first up is patronage. You gotta understand, this was the fabric of their entire society. A powerful person, a patron, would give gifts, protection, or opportunities to someone with less status, a client. It was how you got a job, how you stayed safe. It was how everything got done. The patron was the giver, the benefactor.
And that, of course, leads directly to reciprocity. This is the other side of the coin. If you were the client who got the gift, you were under this massive social obligation to respond. And here's the key: you couldn't pay it back with money. Your job was to show public gratitude, unwavering loyalty, and to honor your patron's name every chance you got. That response was everything. It's what held the relationship together.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because there was this deep social tension built right into the system. The rules were completely different depending on your role. The giver, the patron, was supposed to give the gift freely and then kind of act like it was no big deal, to forget about it. But the receiver? Oh no. They were expected to never, ever forget, and they had to talk about it publicly. To fail to do that was a huge insult.
So you can probably see where this is going. The author of Hebrews does something brilliant. He takes this exact social model that everybody understood and applies it to God and Jesus. He presents them as the ultimate patrons, the most generous benefactors you could possibly imagine, who have given gifts that no earthly patron could even dream of offering.
And just look at this list of benefits. I mean, we are talking about direct access to God anytime you need help. Freedom from the fear of death that haunts people their whole lives. A share in the Holy Spirit. A heavenly home. An unshakable kingdom. These are not small favors. These are profound, life-altering, world-changing gifts from this divine patron.
But how are these incredible gifts delivered? Well, the author presents Jesus as the broker, the great high priest who makes the whole relationship possible. He's the one who secures this divine favor for them, and crucially, he's someone who gets their struggles because he's been through it himself.
Okay, so, if God is the ultimate patron, and he's given these unbelievable gifts through Jesus the broker, then what does that ancient social code of reciprocity demand? What's the expected response from the people who've received all this?
Well, the author doesn't make you guess. He states it plainly. He says, since we are receiving this incredible gift, an unshakable kingdom, the logical, expected, and proper response is to show gratitude. It's a direct appeal to them to hold up their end of this sacred patron-client relationship. But listen, this isn't about just sending a thank you card. In their world, gratitude had to be public, it had to be visible, and the logic was simple. The more valuable the gift, the more costly your loyalty had to be. So the author is arguing that these divine gifts are so massive, so off the charts, that they demand a loyalty that won't break even under the weight of public shame. And then he pushes it even further. He says that just as their patron Jesus suffered shame outside the camp, their ultimate act of loyalty, of reciprocity, is to willingly go join him there, to carry that same disgrace. It's a call to mirror their patron's sacrifice as the ultimate act of loyalty.
But what if you don't? What happens if you get this incredible gift and then just walk away? This is where the author pivots to a really stark warning. He raises the stakes by reminding them just how ugly and dangerous it is to insult a benefactor this powerful and this generous.
And he uses this powerful analogy from farming, one they would have immediately understood. He says, imagine two pieces of land. They both receive the exact same gift, rain from heaven. One piece of land soaks it in and produces a useful crop. It's blessed. But the other piece of land? It gets the same rain, the same gift, and it produces thorns and thistles, a worthless, hurtful response. The rain is God's grace. The crop, well, that's their response.
You see how this totally reframes everything? Walking away from the community is no longer just a practical choice to escape the pressure. Through this lens, it's a deep, personal, ugly insult. The author says it's like trampling on God's Son, treating his incredible sacrifice as if it were common or worthless. It is the ultimate act of ingratitude, a slap in the face to their divine benefactor.
And this really gets us to the core principle that drives this whole letter. And it's a principle that's just as relevant today. Grace must answer grace. An act of incredible favor demands a response of incredible gratitude. The gift and the response, they're locked together in this powerful dance.
So when you strip it all away, the author's main strategy isn't to scare his audience into staying. Not really. It's to get them to grapple with one single powerful question that grows right out of the sheer magnitude of the gifts they've been given.
And that's the question he leaves them with. And it's the one we can leave with too. When a gift is truly free, unimaginably generous, and given at a great cost to the giver, what is the right response? What does that giver deserve in return? The author of Hebrews argues it demands nothing less than a life of loyal, public gratitude. It's a question that cuts right to the heart of what grace really is and how we should respond to it.